Hi there, and welcome to Q English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. Echoes of Eternity: The Life and Mind of Friedrich Nietzsche. Chapter 1. A Child in Röcken: Early Life and Family Roots. In the small village of Röcken, nestled in the Prussian province of Saxony, a boy named Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844. The village was quiet, surrounded by low rolling hills and gentle farmland, where life moved slowly and predictably. Nietzsche came into the world in a modest, pious household, the firstborn child of Karl Ludwig Nietzsche and Franziska Ola. His father, Karl, was a Lutheran pastor known for his soft voice and gentle nature. He was well respected in the village, a man of faith and calm authority. Karl's sermons were poetic and thoughtful, and young Friedrich grew up listening to them with wide eyes and a curious heart. Friedrich's mother, Franziska, was warm but strong-willed, balancing tenderness with discipline. From her, he inherited a quiet resilience that would sustain him in darker years. Tragedy arrived early. When Friedrich was just 4 years old, his father began suffering from severe headaches and mental confusion. The illness, likely a brain ailment, progressed quickly. Within a year, Karl Nietzsche died, and the household fell into grief. Friedrich, his younger sister Elisabeth, and their infant brother Ludwig Joseph were left with their mother and paternal grandmother. The loss etched itself into Friedrich's young mind, shaping a sense of impermanence that would later appear in his philosophy. Just 6 months after his father's death, baby Ludwig Joseph also passed away. These twin losses, his father and brother, within such a short span, gave Friedrich an early understanding of pain and mortality. In the large, echoing house now filled with silence, he began to read first the Bible, then storybooks, and eventually more serious texts borrowed from family friends. As a child, Friedrich was unusually serious and contemplative. While other boys played outside for hours, he preferred to sit alone, sketching letters, memorizing hymns, or copying poems. He had a gift for music, especially the piano, which he began learning at an early age. His mother often found him composing simple melodies and reading aloud in a deep, measured tone far beyond his years. In 1850, the family moved to Naumburg, where Friedrich enrolled in a local preparatory school. Though quiet and introverted, he quickly earned a reputation for academic brilliance. Teachers were astonished by his memory and ability to grasp difficult texts. At the age of 10, he could already read Latin and had begun dabbling in Greek. Yet even in his studies, there was a melancholy air about him. Classmates often remarked that he thought too much for a boy. His mother and aunt played a central role in his upbringing, both women intent on preserving Karl Nietzsche's moral legacy. They kept the household steeped in religious devotion, and Friedrich obeyed dutifully. But inside, questions were growing. He began to sense a dissonance between what he was taught and what he observed in life's suffering and contradictions. By the time he was 12, Friedrich had already read works by German poets like Schiller and Goethe. He admired their ability to blend emotion with intellect, and he began writing poems of his own. Some were dramatic, others deeply personal. He never showed them to anyone outside his family, but the seeds of a unique voice had already been planted. It was also at this age that Friedrich began to experience his first bouts of illness, sharp headaches, eye pain, and fatigue that would come and go without warning. These physical struggles added to his growing introspection. In moments of solitude, he would gaze out windows for hours, lost in thought. He once wrote in a letter to his mother, "There are storms inside me I cannot explain." His entry into the elite boarding school, Schopfurter, in 1858 marked a turning point. But those early years in Röcken and Naumburg remained forever etched in his memory. A soft-spoken father whose sermons moved him to tears, a mother holding the family together with quiet strength, and the silent, aching shadow left by death. These experiences laid the foundation of a soul both wounded and luminous, a boy destined to wrestle with the great questions of meaning, suffering, and existence. Long before he became the philosopher who declared the death of God, Nietzsche was a child shaped by love, loss, music, and solitude. The echoes of Röcken never truly left him. They became the first whisper of eternity that would later roar through his work. Chapter 2. Silent Strength, Schooling and a Spark of Genius. When Nietzsche entered Schopfurter at age 14, it was like stepping into a world carved from stone, serious, ancient, and demanding. The prestigious boarding school was known for its rigorous classical curriculum and strict discipline. The buildings were old and solemn, their thick walls echoing centuries of learned footsteps. It was a place for the brightest, and Nietzsche, with his quiet focus and sharp intellect, quickly found his place among them. Yet life at Schopfurter was far from easy. The school demanded excellence in Latin, Greek, literature, and theology. Days were filled with dense reading, long lectures, and exhaustive exercises. Nietzsche, however, thrived under pressure. He became particularly drawn to the works of the Greek tragedians, especially Aeschylus and Sophocles. Their exploration of fate, suffering, and heroism resonated deeply with him. The themes echoed his own childhood losses and gave voice to feelings he could not yet name. His brilliance did not go unnoticed. Teachers praised his ability to translate complex texts, and fellow students began to refer to him with nicknames like the Little Professor. He stood out not only for his intelligence, but for his discipline and solitary nature. While others socialized in the yard, Nietzsche was often found walking the school grounds alone, a book in hand or his eyes scanning the sky. It was at Schopfurter that Nietzsche's love for language and music matured. He composed piano pieces in his dormitory and filled notebooks with reflections, poetic fragments, and philosophical musings. One of his teachers, recognizing something rare in the boy, encouraged him to pursue philology, the study of classical texts and languages. That suggestion would shape the course of his early academic life. Despite his inner world growing richer, Nietzsche's health continued to be fragile. Frequent migraines and vision problems disrupted his studies. There were days he had to lie in darkness, unable to read or write. But even in those moments, his mind did not rest. He once wrote in a letter to a friend, "My thoughts grow louder in silence." Though he was respected, Nietzsche was never quite at ease socially. He did not enjoy small talk, and often struggled to connect with peers emotionally. His thoughts ran too deep, too fast. While some admired him, others found him distant, even cold. But there were friendships, brief and meaningful, that helped him feel less isolated. One such friend was Gustav Krug, a fellow student with whom he shared a love of music and literature. In 1861, near the end of his time at Schopfurter, Nietzsche experienced a turning point. He discovered the work of Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American essayist and poet. Emerson's ideas on individuality, inner strength, and self-reliance struck a powerful chord. Nietzsche later admitted that Emerson's essays stayed with him longer than any other influence of that time. For a boy still searching for a guiding voice, Emerson offered clarity and courage. By the time Nietzsche graduated in 1864, he had mastered several classical languages, become a skilled pianist, and begun shaping the questions that would later define his philosophy. More than anything, Schopfurter had taught him how to be alone without being lost. It had sharpened his intellect, tested his will, and given him a taste of the life of the mind. As he stepped away from the school's stone gates for the last time, the world ahead was still uncertain. But Friedrich Nietzsche carried with him the silent strength forged in solitude, a foundation strong enough to bear the weight of the radical ideas that would one day shake the foundations of Western thought. Chapter 3. The Scholar of Leipzig University, Years and the Call of Philology. In the fall of 1864, Friedrich Nietzsche entered the University of Bonn eager and uncertain. At just 20 years old, he carried with him the quiet resolve shaped during his years at Schopfurter. Bonn was a larger, livelier place than he had ever known. The streets buzzed with youthful energy, cafes spilled into the sidewalks, and the lectures were animated by some of the sharpest minds in Prussia. But Nietzsche remained, as always, a solitary figure, absorbed, intense, and a little out of place. Initially, he intended to study theology. in keeping with family tradition and his upbringing. His mother had dreams of him following in his father's pastoral footsteps, but it did not take long before he abandoned that path. Nietzsche sat through the lectures on scripture and divinity with a growing sense of unease. The words felt hollow, the doctrines rigid. He found more life in the syntax of Homer and the tragedies of Euripides than in sermons about salvation. Within a few months, Nietzsche switched his focus entirely to philology. He threw himself into the ancient texts with passion. Under the guidance of Friedrich Wilhelm Ritschl, one of the most respected philologists of the time, Nietzsche began to shine. Ritschl quickly recognized the young man's talent and urged him to transfer to the University of Leipzig, where the academic environment would better match his abilities. Leipzig was a city of music, scholarship, and quiet ambition. Here, Nietzsche flourished. He devoured the classics, Plato, Aristotle, Heraclitus, grappling with the roots of Western thought in their original tongues. He learned to see language not just as communication, but as a vessel of culture, belief, and power. He read not only to understand, but to wrestle, to challenge. At Leipzig, a fateful encounter occurred. In 1865, he discovered Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation. The impact was immediate and profound. Schopenhauer's vision of a world driven by blind, irrational will resonated with Nietzsche's own brooding reflections. The book seemed to speak directly to the doubts and disquiet he had carried since childhood. For days after finishing it, he could barely sleep. It was, he later wrote, the first time I recognized a philosophical voice that sounded like my own. This discovery marked a turning point. Schopenhauer became Nietzsche's invisible mentor, shaping the mood and direction of his early philosophy. Though Nietzsche would later distance himself from Schopenhauer's pessimism, in those formative years, the kinship felt real and necessary. Nietzsche also began to write more seriously. He penned essays on classical texts, poetry, and the nature of aesthetics. His prose was dense but electric, brimming with insight. Professors marveled at his originality. At just 24, he published articles in respected journals, rare for someone so young. He even adopted a sparse yet forceful writing style that would become his hallmark. Amid his intellectual pursuits, Nietzsche found little time for social life. He remained inward, absorbed in thought, and plagued by physical ailments, persistent headaches, worsening vision, and digestive troubles. Still, he pressed on. His letters from this time reveal both his discipline and his loneliness. I walk with the ancients, he once wrote to a friend, but no one walks with me. Despite these difficulties, his achievements stood out. Ritschl, his mentor, lobbied hard for Nietzsche's advancement, and in 1869, before completing his doctorate, Nietzsche was appointed to a professorship in classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland. He was only 24 years old, the youngest ever to receive such a position at the time. Leipzig had been more than a university for Nietzsche. It was a forge. Here, he refined his intellect, found his first philosophical guide, and laid the groundwork for a lifetime of radical thought. He arrived as a student of words and departed as a man who had begun to question the very foundations of truth. The quiet student who once lingered in shadows was stepping onto a new stage, armed not with certainty, but with the courage to ask the hardest questions. As he prepared to leave Germany for Basel, Nietzsche stood on the edge of transformation. The scholar was ready. The philosopher was awakening. Chapter 4. The Basel Years. A young professor in a foreign land. The year was 1869, and Friedrich Nietzsche crossed the German border into Switzerland with a sense of both relief and anticipation. Basel welcomed him not as a student, but as a professor, the youngest in the university's history. Yet, beneath the formal honor, he remained a man burdened by doubt and physical frailty. He carried no doctorate, no thick portfolio of publications. Only the brilliance that Ritschl and others had insisted was enough. It was a bold beginning. Basel, with its calm, river-split charm and orderly academic life, proved both sanctuary and constraint. Nietzsche settled into a modest apartment, his window opening to views of rooftops and sky. The pace was slower than Leipzig's, and the faculty collegial but conservative. Yet, Nietzsche brought with him something rare, an energy that pulsed beneath the surface, one that refused to be tamed by tradition. His lectures in philology began with careful, even timid outlines of Greek grammar and meter, but gradually he broke form. He spoke not just of words and syntax, but of the spirit behind the texts. To his students, this was both exhilarating and confusing. Some were captivated, others found him too unconventional. Nietzsche, for his part, struggled with the weight of formal teaching. The classroom never fully suited him. It felt like a mask he had to wear. Still, he poured himself into it. Outside his duties, Nietzsche began to form a new intellectual circle. He was introduced to the music of Richard Wagner, whose operas and grand ideas stirred something deep within him. Their first meeting in Tripschen was like the convergence of two storms. Wagner was loud, dramatic, and magnetic. Nietzsche, in contrast, was soft-spoken and inward. But they shared a love of Greek tragedy, Schopenhauer's philosophy, and a disdain for the moral complacency of modern culture. Their bond deepened quickly. Wagner became a father figure, a mentor, and a symbol of artistic revolution. Nietzsche visited often, listening to Wagner's bold visions of a new kind of art, a total artwork, Gesamtkunstwerk, that could heal the spiritual wounds of modernity. At Wagner's home, he met Cosima, Wagner's wife, and other influential artists and thinkers. Nietzsche felt, for the first time, part of something larger. During these years, Nietzsche also wrote his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, Out of the Spirit of Music, 1872. In it, he argued that the greatness of Greek tragedy lay not in its structure, but in its fusion of two forces, Apollonian order and Dionysian chaos. It was an audacious claim and one that owed more to intuition and philosophy than strict philology. His academic peers were skeptical, even scornful. One colleague called it a philosopher's fantasy. But Nietzsche had found his voice poetic, forceful, unapologetically original. Though The Birth of Tragedy received little academic praise, Wagner celebrated it. Nietzsche was flattered but also conflicted. He was beginning to see cracks in Wagner's persona, hints of ego, authoritarianism, and an obsession with German nationalism that Nietzsche found increasingly troubling. Meanwhile, Nietzsche's health began to decline. The headaches worsened. Bright light became unbearable. He suffered nausea, long stretches of fatigue, and sharp bouts of neural pain. Despite frequent retreats to the Alps or quiet villages for rest, relief never lasted. Doctors offered little help, often prescribing treatments that made matters worse. In his letters, he confessed his despair. Each morning is a decision to persist. Still, he worked. He translated, lectured, and drafted new essays. His mind remained sharp, even as his body rebelled. Slowly, he began to withdraw from university life. The routines drained him, and the academic world seemed increasingly distant from the ideas he wished to explore. He longed for freedom to think without obligation, to write without constraint. The tension between his role as professor and his nature as a solitary thinker reached a breaking point. In 1876, after a series of extended leaves and mounting illness, Nietzsche formally resigned from the University of Basel. He was only 32. His students and colleagues were surprised, some even dismissive, but Nietzsche felt something different: liberation. He had shed the last external structure of conventional life. No more lectures, no more meetings, no more pretending. Ahead lay uncertainty, yes, but also the open sky of thought. As he left the stone halls of Basel for the last time, Nietzsche was no longer the young scholar seeking validation. He was becoming something else entirely, a wandering philosopher, untethered from institutions, driven by questions no classroom could contain. Chapter 5. Walking Alone, Illness, Wandering, and the Break with Wagner. With his resignation from the University of Basel in 1876, Nietzsche stepped into an uncertain world, no longer protected by the boundaries of academia. He began a new life of movement, of temporary homes, long walks through mountains, and relentless writing. He traveled mostly alone, seeking climates that might ease his persistent ailments. Sorrento, Genoa, Venice, Nice, and the Engadin Valley in the Swiss Alps became seasonal refuges. Illness was Nietzsche's constant companion. Each morning was a trial. His eyesight weakened further, migraines struck without warning, and his digestion often left him bedridden. But these conditions also freed him from distraction. Unable to teach or engage in public life, he focused on thinking and writing. He developed a strict routine: morning walks, afternoons at the desk, and evenings in silence. It was during this time that his thoughts began to diverge sharply from those of Richard Wagner. What had once been admiration was slowly turning to disappointment, then disillusionment. Nietzsche visited Wagner at Bayreuth, hoping to reconnect, but the experience left him disturbed. Wagner's opera festival had become a nationalist spectacle, drenched in pomp and conservative ideology. Nietzsche, always sensitive to authenticity, saw in Wagner's grandiosity a betrayal of art's true spirit. In 1878, Nietzsche published Human, All Too Human, a bold, aphoristic work that marked a clear departure from Wagner's influence and Schopenhauer's pessimism. In its pages, he turned his gaze toward science, psychology, and historical analysis. He challenged traditional morality, questioned religion, and examined human behavior with a piercing, often cold lens. It was a book of dissection, not devotion. The fallout was swift. Wagner was wounded, publicly and personally. Their friendship never recovered. Cosima, who had once admired Nietzsche, now wrote him off as a traitor. Among Wagner's circle, Nietzsche was ridiculed and dismissed. But he did not retreat. The severing of that bond, though painful, was also emancipating. He had outgrown the need for intellectual fathers. Financially, Nietzsche remained precarious. He received a modest pension from the University of Basel, but it barely covered his needs. He lived simply, no servants, no excess. He wrote in cramped rooms, often with blankets pinned to the windows to block the glare. His life was one of voluntary exile. Despite his isolation, he corresponded regularly with friends and admirers. He sent long letters filled with wit, irony, and flashes of brilliance. Some days, he doubted whether anyone understood him at all. "I write for readers who have not yet been born," he once noted, half in jest. Yet his work began to evolve into something utterly original. Between 1879 and 1881, he published several volumes, The Dawn and The Gay Science among them, each more daring than the last. He experimented with form, favoring aphorisms and poetic prose. He refined his ideas about morality, the will to power, and the role of the philosopher in society. He no longer sought to persuade, only to provoke. One image of these years captures him best: walking alone through a mountain path, notebook in hand, a thin figure in dark clothes, eyes narrowed by pain but burning with thought. To the world, he was obscure, perhaps eccentric, but within, he was building a legacy unlike any other. It was also during this time that Nietzsche began to speak of becoming who one is. No longer shaped by mentors or academic expectations, he was now carving a path entirely his own. The sickness, the solitude, the silence, all of it had become part of the process. His suffering did not break him. It refined him. By the early 1880s, Friedrich Nietzsche had become a philosopher of a different kind, one who walked alone, but whose words would soon echo across generations. Chapter 6. Thus spoke Zarathustra, a voice from the mountains. In the winter of 1881, high in the Swiss town of Sils-Maria, Nietzsche stood beneath a tall fir tree overlooking the shimmering Lake Silvaplana. As he watched the water stretch endlessly into the snow-bright horizon, a sudden thought descended upon him, clear, whole, and unshakable. It was not an idea in the ordinary sense, but a vision. He would later call it the eternal recurrence, and from it would emerge his most poetic and enigmatic work. Thus spoke Zarathustra. By this time, Nietzsche had grown comfortable with his outsider status. His health continued to fluctuate, but he had adapted to the rhythms of solitude. He spent weeks in Sils-Maria each summer, preferring its crisp air and isolation. These mountain walks fed his mind. He carried notebooks and scribbled down thoughts as they came, sometimes stopping for hours to refine a single phrase. To an onlooker, he appeared simply as a solitary wanderer. To Nietzsche, each step was part of a grand philosophical ascent. In 1883, After months of silent preparation, Nietzsche began writing Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a book for all and none. He did not intend it as a systematic philosophy, but as a narrative, a myth for the modern age. Its central figure, Zarathustra, was not the historical prophet of Zoroastrianism, but a fictional sage who wandered mountains, wrestling with profound truths and speaking in riddles. Through him, Nietzsche voiced his deepest beliefs: the death of God, the will to power, the Overman Bemensch, and the eternal return. The style of Zarathustra was unlike anything he had written before. It was lyrical, rhythmic, and at times prophetic. He wrote in bursts of energy, sometimes completing entire chapters in a single sitting. The process was feverish. He would later recall moments when he wept or laughed uncontrollably while writing, so fully was he consumed by his vision. But when he began publishing the book in parts between 1883 and 1885, the world was unmoved. Critics ignored it. Booksellers returned unsold copies. Even Nietzsche's closest friends were baffled. The book, with its poetic density and symbolic force, was too strange, too radical. He felt invisible. And yet, he pressed on. Writing Zarathustra was not for the sake of fame, but necessity. He often called it my gift to humanity. To Nietzsche, the book was not just a literary work, but a kind of scripture, a guide for those willing to transcend the herd mentality and create their own values. In his notebooks, he wrote of the higher man, one who could live without illusions, affirm life despite its suffering, and shape meaning from chaos. This was not a philosophy of comfort. It demanded courage, self-overcoming, and solitude. Few were ready to hear it, but Nietzsche believed they would come, readers of the future, wanderers like himself. Between writing sessions, he lived quietly. He walked long distances each day, often wrapped in a thick coat, hat pulled low against the wind. He dined alone, kept minimal correspondence, and read widely. On his bookshelf were volumes of Greek tragedy, Spinoza, Stendhal, and French moralists. Though physically frail, his mental world expanded. By the time he completed the fourth part of Zarathustra, Nietzsche knew he had created something timeless. Yet he also sensed that the book marked a turning point. Zarathustra is not just a book, he wrote. It is a fate. He had cast off every remaining tie to academic respectability, to tradition, even to conventional prose. What remained was pure Nietzsche, fierce, visionary, and alone. In the years that followed, he would continue to write feverishly, but Thus Spoke Zarathustra remained the heart of his thought. It was the mountain peak from which everything else descended. And like Zarathustra, Nietzsche too would descend, not to rest, but to confront the world that still did not understand him. Copyright notice. Cool English Channel. All rights reserved. This video and its content are protected by copyright law. Unauthorized copying, redistribution, re-uploading, or modification of this content is strictly prohibited and may result in legal action. Respect the creator. Do not steal. Chapter 7. War of Ideas. Critique, Madness Foreshadowed, and Final Clarity. After completing Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche felt both liberated and restless. He had poured his soul into a book that few read and fewer understood, but he did not stop. In the years that followed, between 1885 and 1888, Nietzsche entered what he called his most productive period. The solitude had deepened, but so had the intensity of his vision. He wrote almost continuously, his ideas sharper, more radical, and increasingly defiant. He completed Beyond Good and Evil in 1886. It was a deliberate counter to the moral assumptions of his time. In its pages, he struck at the heart of European values, attacking the complacency of rational philosophers and exposing the hidden will to power beneath so-called objective thinking. The style was controlled but biting, filled with aphorisms that cut deep. He who fights with monsters, he wrote, should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. The following year, he published On the Genealogy of Morality, a work that explored the origins of human conscience, guilt, and punishment. Nietzsche traced the evolution of morality not from lofty ideals, but from struggle, resentment, and domination. He painted Christianity as a religion of weakness, one that turned suffering into virtue and poisoned the will to live. It was provocative, unsettling, and brilliant. But Nietzsche's personal life was fraying. He moved constantly, shifting from Turin to Nice, from Genoa to Sils Maria, seeking relief from his ailments and a stable place to work. He often lived in small, dimly lit rooms, surrounded by books and papers, writing feverishly by candlelight. The migraines came more often now. His letters to friends grew erratic, sometimes grandiose, other times oddly detached. He referred to his final years of writing as his campaign against morality. The titles of his books said as much: The Case of Wagner, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, and Ecce Homo. In these, Nietzsche took aim at culture, religion, nationalism, and philosophy itself. He used irony and exaggeration as tools of demolition. In Twilight of the Idols, he offered a hammer with which to test the hollow idols of society. The Antichrist went even further, declaring Christianity the greatest misfortune of mankind. And then there was Ecce Homo, a strange and haunting text in which Nietzsche reviewed his life and work with a mixture of pride, humor, and ominous self-awareness. Chapter titles included Why I Am So Clever and Why I Write Such Good Books. To some, it read as arrogance. To others, it was a final act of philosophical performance. Yet in its pages, there was also loneliness, a sense that he had reached the summit only to find himself completely alone. By late 1888, Nietzsche's mental state began to unravel. Friends received letters filled with cryptic claims. He called himself Dionysus and the Crucified. He wrote to the Pope, two kings, two long-dead composers. He signed letters Nietzsche, Caesar, or the Redeemer. Something had broken within him. The signs had been there for years, the headaches, the hallucinations, the emotional extremes, but now the collapse was visible. On January 3, 1889, in the streets of Turin, Nietzsche witnessed a horse being beaten. Rushing to its side, he threw his arms around the animal's neck and then collapsed to the ground, sobbing. He never recovered. Doctors diagnosed him with a mental breakdown, likely triggered by a long-standing neurological condition, possibly syphilis. His once fierce mind had gone silent. The man who had written of overcoming of the heroic solitude of the philosopher would spend the rest of his days in mute dependency. And yet, in those final lucid writings, there had been clarity, a voice at the edge of madness, still pulsing with insight. Nietzsche had seen too far, perhaps. He had held the mirror too steadily before the world, and perhaps before himself. In his last full year of writing, he penned a line that now seems prophetic. One day, my name will be associated with something tremendous, a crisis like never before on earth. He would not live to see that future. But the tremor he had set in motion was only beginning. Chapter 8. A Silent Descent, Madness, Dependency, and the Final Years. The once brilliant voice of Friedrich Nietzsche fell silent in January 1889, when his collapse in the streets of Turin marked the end of his intellectual autonomy. From that moment, his world changed dramatically, shifting from the sharp edges of philosophical critique to the muted haze of mental illness. He would live for another 11 years, but never again as the philosopher who once walked alone among alpine peaks. After the collapse, Nietzsche was briefly hospitalized in Basel, then transferred to a psychiatric clinic in Jena. His condition, diagnosed at the time as tertiary syphilis, a common yet imprecise attribution in the 19th century, manifested in delusions, emotional instability, and eventual silence. At first, he wrote incomprehensible notes and made strange declarations, but soon the writing stopped. The mind that had once danced with Apollo and Dionysus became still. His mother, Franziska, took him into her care in Nuremberg. Devout, practical, and loyal, she devoted herself to nursing her son. Their roles had reversed. The child who once recited Luther's hymns at her knee now sat for hours without speaking, staring through windows, unshaven and unaware. Visitors described him as gentle, often smiling vacantly, sometimes humming or pacing. Yet he never resumed the work he had once lived for. The pen, once an extension of his soul, remained untouched. The house in Nürnberg was quiet. Franziska kept it tidy, kept meals regular, and allowed few visitors. Occasionally old friends came, Peter Gast among them, and left in tears. It was hard to reconcile the silent figure before them with the sharp, laughing Nietzsche of the past. There were rare moments of recognition, a flicker of awareness, a soft word, but they vanished as quickly as they came. In 1897, Franziska died. The responsibility of care passed to Nietzsche's sister, Elisabeth Foster Nietzsche. She brought him to Weimar, where she had established an archive devoted to her brother's work. It was here, under her control, that Nietzsche's posthumous reputation would be both preserved and distorted. Elisabeth was fiercely ambitious and ideologically driven. A nationalist and an admirer of authoritarian thought, she saw in her brother's writings a legacy she could shape. She edited his unpublished notes, arranged fragments into new books like The Will to Power, and presented Nietzsche as a prophet of German strength and anti-modern sentiment. Many of these interpretations were far from his original intent. Meanwhile, Nietzsche's condition remained unchanged. He spent his days seated in gardens, sometimes fed by hand, sometimes led on walks. He was no longer capable of conversation or decision. There were no more aphorisms, no more letters, no more critiques of Wagner or Socrates. Silence had taken over. And yet, in that silence, the world around him began to stir. His earlier works, once ignored, were being rediscovered. Young artists, writers, and philosophers found in Nietzsche's iconoclasm a voice for their age. His ideas spread through the cafes of Paris, the salons of Berlin, the universities of St. Petersburg. Without lifting a pen, Nietzsche became a voice of the future. By the end of the 1890s, his fame had grown, albeit in distorted forms. Some saw him as a nihilist, others as a proto-fascist, others still as a prophet of radical individualism. He could no longer respond, no longer clarify, no longer laugh at the absurdities. On August 25, 1900, Friedrich Nietzsche died of complications from a stroke and pneumonia. He was 55 years old. His body was returned to Röcken, where he was buried beside his father in the churchyard of his childhood. The sky was grey. The ceremony was modest. Those who stood by his grave could not have foreseen the storm that would follow. The battles over his thoughts, the claims made in his name, the twisted interpretations and genuine tributes. But for the man himself, the struggle had ended. He had climbed the mountain alone, and in the silence of his final years, the world slowly began to hear his echo. Chapter 9. Beyond the Grave. Legacy, Misuse, and the Battle for Nietzsche's Thought. Friedrich Nietzsche's death did not mark the end of his story. It was, in many ways, the beginning of an entirely new chapter, one over which he had no control. With his voice silenced and his manuscripts left in varying states of completeness, others stepped in to interpret, collect, publish, and at times manipulate his legacy. Elisabeth Foster Nietzsche took a leading role. Having cared for her brother in his final years, she now saw herself as the guardian of his name. In Weimar, she established the Nietzsche Archive, turning it into a pilgrimage site for intellectuals, artists, and political ideologues. Surrounded by the relics of her brother's life, his furniture, letters, eyeglasses, visitors were given a guided view of Nietzsche's work, one often reframed to fit Elisabeth's worldview. She published edited versions of his notebooks, most notably The Will to Power, a compilation of his fragmented thoughts arranged to form what she presented as a culminating philosophical system. But Nietzsche had never assembled such a book. The structure, emphasis, and editorial shaping were hers. This reinterpretation turned him into a prophet of strength, will, and destiny ideals she aligned with the rising nationalist fervor in Germany. As the early 20th century unfolded, Nietzsche's reputation grew in unexpected directions. In France, intellectuals like André Gide and Albert Camus read him as a liberator of the self, a challenger of outdated morality. In Russia, he inspired revolutionaries and poets alike, though often in contradiction. In Germany, His words were invoked by both bohemians and reactionaries. Few thinkers were interpreted in such conflicting ways. The most troubling misappropriation came during the rise of the Nazi regime. Adolf Hitler, eager to claim philosophical backing for his movement, visited the Nietzsche archive in 1934, posed for photographs beside a bust of the philosopher, and praised his insights, despite the fact that Nietzsche had openly despised anti-Semitism and German nationalism. Elisabeth, who died in 1935, had helped craft a Nietzsche that suited these purposes. She omitted passages critical of nationalism and published letters selectively. The result was a public image of Nietzsche that bore little resemblance to the man himself. After the Second World War, scholars began the long work of reclaiming Nietzsche from these distortions. Critical editions of his texts were published. His true attitudes, skeptical, ironic, and often deeply human, re-emerged. He was not the architect of fascism, but its misunderstood victim. His writings were restored as provocations, not prescriptions. His aphorisms, once dismissed as literary play, became central to new fields of thought. Post-structuralist philosophers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida found in Nietzsche a forerunner to their critiques of power and language. Psychologists revisited his insights into resentment and the will. Artists admired his bold style, his attacks on convention, his embrace of contradiction. In the 21st century, Nietzsche's words live in many places, tattooed on forearms, quoted in songs, debated in classrooms, and echoed in manifestos. He remains a figure both revered and feared, as capable of inspiring self-discovery as he is of igniting controversy. Yet above all, he endures as a voice of inquiry, a man who dared to ask uncomfortable questions and reject easy answers. He never sought disciples. In fact, he warned against them. One repays a teacher badly, he once wrote, if one remains only a pupil. Perhaps that is the most enduring part of Nietzsche's legacy, not a doctrine to follow, but an invitation to think dangerously, speak honestly, and live, as he once wrote, beyond good and evil. Chapter 10. The Eternal Return. Nietzsche in the Modern Mind. In the more than a century since Friedrich Nietzsche's death, his shadow has stretched across philosophy, literature, psychology, politics, and art. Few thinkers have been so often invoked and so often misunderstood. Today, Nietzsche exists both as a foundational figure in academic discourse and as a symbol in popular culture, a dual legacy that continues to grow and evolve. In philosophy, Nietzsche's ideas have become central to the postmodern critique of knowledge, power, and identity. Michel Foucault cited him as an intellectual forebear, crediting Nietzsche with revealing the power structures behind morality and truth. Jacques Derrida, in his theory of deconstruction, found in Nietzsche's style and contradictions a kindred spirit. Heidegger devoted long lectures to unpacking Nietzsche's concept of the will to power, while existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir found in him a predecessor who questioned the foundations of meaning. Nietzsche's critique of religion, his declaration that God is dead, and his suspicion of herd morality have shaped modern secular humanism. His celebration of the individual, especially the idea of becoming who one is, has inspired generations to seek authenticity in a world often driven by conformity. The concept of the Bermensch, though widely misinterpreted, has served as a symbol of aspiration beyond societal limitations. Psychology, too, has been influenced by Nietzsche. Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud both acknowledged his insights into the unconscious, repression, and the complex motivations behind human behavior. More recently, psychologists have examined Nietzsche's reflections on suffering, resilience, and personal growth, finding relevance in therapeutic contexts and discussions of mental health. In literature and art, Nietzsche's presence is unmistakable. Writers like Hermann Hesse, Thomas Mann, and James Joyce wove his ideas into their characters and themes. Poets admired his lyrical, aphoristic style. Painters and filmmakers drew from his imagery, the abyss, the eternal return, the tightrope walker between beast and god. Even popular culture has embraced Nietzsche. His quotes appear on posters, tattoos, social media, and video games. Characters in television shows and movies cite him, sometimes thoughtfully, sometimes theatrically. In some corners of the internet, he is treated as a rebellious icon. In others, a misunderstood prophet. The phrase "that which does not kill us makes us stronger" has entered common speech, often stripped of its context, but still resonant. Yet amid this ubiquity lies a deeper tension. Nietzsche's work resists simplification. His writing is dense, playful, and full of masks. He questioned everything, including himself. He warned against the comfort of dogma and the safety of labels. To truly engage with Nietzsche is not to find answers, but to learn how to ask better questions. Academic efforts in recent decades have aimed to restore nuance to his legacy. New critical editions in German and English have corrected earlier distortions. Scholars emphasize the literary quality of his prose, the complexity of his metaphors, and the importance of his historical context. Interdisciplinary studies have explored Nietzsche alongside neuroscience, political theory, and gender studies. In education, Nietzsche remains a compelling figure. His ideas are introduced in high school ethics classes and debated in graduate seminars. His words challenge students to confront difficult truths about power, identity, and meaning. He is often a gateway to deeper philosophical inquiry, a voice that, once heard, is not easily forgotten. Ultimately, Nietzsche's influence is not confined to what he wrote, but in how he invites us to think. His questions continue to echo. What does it mean to live well? Who defines value? How do we make sense of a world without absolute foundations? These are questions that each generation must answer anew. Nietzsche, in his solitude, once imagined that his readers would not be found for 100 years. He was right and wrong. He was read in his lifetime, but rarely understood. He is read more widely now, but still often misread. And yet, through it all, his voice endures, challenging, unsettling, liberating. Like the mountains he once wandered, he remains towering, silent, and always waiting for those who dare the climb. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.